combating criminalization to end sanctions and sexual violence domestically and abroad. Women, trans and cis, and children are aggressively targeted, but sexual violence impacts all genders, including men, trans and cis. We're taught to think about sexual violence as an interpersonal problem, but sexual violence and tolerance for it is so widespread that we are contending with an entire culture of rape and coercion, compliance through intimidation, threat of force. This culture of rape and coercion is a byproduct of living under racial capitalism, a political economy that is rooted in one rich minority class domination and oppression of the working and oppressed majority classes and the planet for maximum social control and profit. Sexual violence is political violence, and it cannot be separated from the violence of racial capitalism. Racial capitalism leads to assert a culture of rape and coercion in every aspect of daily life in hopes of rendering us less resistant to all systems of exploitation and oppression, from the work grind to flooded streets and ICE raids at home to genocides abroad, with sexual violence prevalent throughout it all. It is no coincidence that the highest levels of political power in this country, the capitalist ruling class, are actively participating in trying to cover up an international child sex trafficking ring, while also leading the charge on imperialist war and global sanctions. Sanctions, sometimes called embargoes, are bans on trade. But when the U.S. capitalist class enforces sanctions, they also punish other countries if they attempt to trade with a country under U.S. sanctions. The U.S. ruling class uses sanctions to starve working people all over the world into submission to U.S. political domination. It costs tens of billions of tax dollars a year to enforce U.S. sanctions. Basic necessities are denied entry into other sovereign countries like fuel, food, medicine, and medical supplies like syringes and birth control. While the capitalist state continues to hold our most basic needs hostage, they use our tax dollars to hold hostage the needs of working class people in Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, and Gaza, punishing any and all who do not submit to complete domination and extraction. The capitalist state thrives off of a culture of rape and coercion and complete disregard for bodily autonomy to ensure we comply with an economic and political system rooted in domination domestically and globally. Sexual violence is implicitly encouraged by the ruling class to maintain a dynamic of control. There is a reason that sexual violence is practiced mainly by people in positions of authority, including from within our own families to cornerstones of community institutions, coaches, spiritual leaders, etc., to CEOs and American presidents past and present. Right here in New Orleans, Gail Benson, the district attorney's office, and even the highest levels of leadership within Saints and Pelicans have not faced consequences for their role in helping to facilitate and hide decades of sexual violence and trafficking of children within the Catholic Archdiocese of New Orleans. Under the capitalist state, sexual violence is far more protected than survivors. From wherever the sexual violence is coming, the capitalist state's response at every level is the same: close ranks and shield abusers and enablers of sexual violence. The capitalist state has no real plans to disrupt cycles of violence that they benefit from. Resources and services that help survivors of sexual violence are slashed, but local politicians and capitalists will work together to expand surveillance, police budgets, and jails in the name of safety, when in reality, criminalization, privatization of resources, and punishment actually ensures that cycles of violence continue. Criminalization is a necessary tool to perpetuate violence as a solution, domestically and globally, which we must resist. Criminalization is being used to strengthen the violent arm of the countries that do not fall in line with the political and economic agenda of the U.S. capitalist ruling class, as we are seeing in Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran. Each layer of coercion builds upon the next, so that everything from sex trafficking to sanctions is normalized as business as usual. under the capitalist state. All this criminalization of others, and yet we know the capitalist class will never hold themselves accountable for the conditions of violence they create in an unending pursuit of more social control and more profit. Socialism, which is demonized by capitalist propaganda, is a political economy that strives to meet needs according to needs. As such, socialism requires a culture of cooperation, not coercion. Imagine an economy rooted in ensuring that needs are met, not held hostage for profit. Under a socialist political economy, basic human needs like housing and healthcare are guaranteed human rights that are fully funded and accessible to all. How much domestic and sexual violence will be resolved just by ensuring that everyone has access to safe and healthy housing, regardless of job, documentation, or relationship status. The capitalist state will never resolve the problems it creates, especially since the capitalist state thrives off of our unnecessary suffering and premature debt. As such, we cannot rely on the capitalist state or the tools of the capitalist state, like criminalization and punishment, if we are serious about defending ourselves against a culture of rape and coercion. We can begin confronting this culture of rape and coercion both on a domestic and global scale by adopting a non-criminalized practice of community defense and working to build a culture of consent among each other. Both are necessary for our immediate safety and to help us build the power we need to collectively pivot away from a capitalist economy altogether. Practicing non-criminalized community defense and building a culture of consent. Consent is agreement and participation based on a person's own will as opposed to being pressured by an external person or force. Consent is often used in the context of sex, but consent can and should be practiced in all aspects of life. There is so little education on how to practice consent in our homes, schools, workplace, and our medical treatment, and so on, because practicing a culture of consent over time will have people questioning the daily exploitation, oppression, and domination in our lives. Practicing a culture of consent starts with encouraging people to speak up instead of keeping their heads down and staying silent. Building a culture of consent asks each person to play an active role in our shared spaces. When we practice consent in all things, we begin to weaken the culture of rape and coercion the capitalist state depends on to maintain social control and profit. Doing the work to build a culture of consent helps us to deepen our practice of non-criminalized community defense by practicing accountability. Practicing accountability is a process that empowers people to take control of situations that we are often told to ignore or let criminalization handle. For some, accountability may feel like punishment, but it is really about collectively enforcing consequences that addresses the problem at the root, to transform outcomes, not recreate them or sweep them under the rug. If a person does not want to be held accountable, our communities still have the opportunity to hold ourselves accountable. In the case of sexual violence, we can do this by disrupting the conditions that provide a person an opportunity to violate someone else in the first place. We can collectively agree to no longer allow someone to move in community in the same ways they did before the practice of sexual violence or any other violence rooted in domination was revealed. We can also practice accountability by refusing to accept criminalization as a justification to deny people their basic human needs, from those held in solitary confinement to those resisting U.S. sanctions in their countries. None of this work can be done individually. Action-oriented solidarity with one another is how we build a culture of consent, non-criminalized community defense, and hold ourselves accountable. By engaging in these practices collectively, we are able to strengthen our fight back against sexual violence and all forms of unnecessary suffering and premature death that happen under racial capitalism. The violence of the capitalist state will not relent, so we cannot relent in the work we are doing to protect our communities and build solidarity domestically and globally against all forms of violence that the capitalist state creates. There will never be a world without conflict, but there can be a world in which our collective culture is built on cooperation and care, not rape and coercion. We are not starting from scratch, but it is our job to accelerate and normalize this critical work.